James stood in the middle of the massive bakery, his knees trembling, tears streaming freely down his face as customers and staff froze in stunned silence. The man who once laughed while divorce papers were shoved across a birthday table was now sobbing openly, his voice breaking as he begged the very woman he had publicly destroyed. Melissa's eyes were cold, steady, unyielding. Every word she spoke struck like a hammer, reminding him of the humiliation, the mockery, the laughter of his family, the cruelty he had proudly displayed. There was no mercy in her tone, no softness left to exploit. This was not the broken woman Cloverfield once ridiculed. This was a woman who had survived the fire and emerged unrecognizable. As James staggered backward, shattered and exposed, one truth hung heavy in the air. The tables had turned completely, and there was no going back. But this moment did not happen overnight. It was forged through betrayal, tears, silence, resilience, and an unyielding refusal to remain broken. How did a woman who was forced to sign divorce papers on her birthday rise to this height? How did laughter turn into regret and shame into strength? Sit back, relax, and allow yourself to be drawn into this deeply emotional and remarkable story as we journey back to where it all began in the lively, gossip-filled city of Cloverfield. Melissa woke up that morning with a strange heaviness she could not explain, the kind that sits on the chest like an unspoken warning. Yet she brushed it aside the way she had learned to brush aside many things since marriage. 30 felt important to her. Not because Cloverfield celebrated numbers loudly, but because she had quietly believed that this birthday marked a turning point. In the early days with James, birthdays were simple, but warm. Handwritten notes slipped under her pillow, breakfast made awkwardly but lovingly, promises whispered about the future they would build together. Back then, James used to look at her like she was his answered prayer, and she carried those memories like pressed flowers between the pages of her heart. Cloverfield was already alive outside, vendors shouting, neighbors peeking through curtains, gossip warming up its engines. Her relatives had been invited for dinner that evening, and though her marriage had grown cold over the years, she told herself that family gatherings had a way of softening hearts. She remembered a scripture her mother used to repeat when days felt uncertain: "Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established," from Proverbs 16 verse 3, and she clung to it as she dressed carefully, choosing a simple gown James once said he liked. She baked her own birthday cake that afternoon, the smell of vanilla filling the house, because baking had always calmed her nerves, even though she had set that part of herself aside to become the kind of wife Cloverfield praised: quiet, supportive, invisible when needed. As evening crept in, chairs were arranged, plates set, and relatives began to arrive with loud voices and curious eyes, some already whispering before they even sat down. Melissa noticed how James barely spoke to her, how his eyes darted around the room as though he were waiting for something or someone. Still, she smiled, reminding herself that hope, though fragile, was not foolish. She had learned to swallow disappointment like bitter medicine, trusting that patience would eventually bear fruit. Because hadn't she also learned that hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a desire fulfilled is a tree of life, from Proverbs 13 verse 12? She did not know then that the tree she was waiting for had already been cut at the roots. Dinner began with forced laughter, the kind that rang hollow, and stories that went nowhere. Melissa sat at the table listening to relatives dissecting other people's lives the way Cloverfield always did, everyone minding everyone else's business, tongues wagging freely like market bells. She felt like a guest in her own home, nodding politely while James' mother laughed too loudly at jokes that were not funny, while his cousins cast her sideways glances that carried judgment without words. When the cake was finally brought out, candles flickering softly, Melissa closed her eyes to make a wish, her heart whispering a prayer instead. She barely had time to exhale before James stood up, clearing his throat with a sharpness that sliced through the room. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, the calm before a storm. He did not smile. There was no toast. His voice came out cold, edged with years of resentment he had apparently been sharpening in secret. He spoke of stagnation, of missed opportunities, of how his life had gone nowhere since marrying her, words tumbling out like stones aimed deliberately to bruise. He called her bad luck without blinking, as though saying it aloud finally freed him. Melissa felt the room tilt, felt every eye turn toward her, curiosity morphing into entertainment. Her ears rang as laughter erupted from corners of the table, some people clapping as though this were a performance arranged for their pleasure. Then he placed the divorce papers beside her untouched cake, the symbolism cruel and deliberate, like salt rubbed into an open wound. Her hands trembled as she stared at the documents, ink blurring through tears she refused to let fall, just yet. She remembered another scripture, one her father loved. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up, from Psalm 27 verse 10. But in that moment, even faith felt distant, muffled by humiliation. James' relatives leaned in, urging her to sign, voices dripping with mockery, telling her not to hold him back any longer, telling her she should be grateful he had endured her at all. It felt like being pushed into a corner while everyone pretended it was for her own good, and Cloverfield drank it all in hungrily. Before Melissa could gather herself, the front door opened, and the air in the room shifted dramatically. Pamela walked in like a verdict already delivered, heels clicking with confidence, her presence loud even before she spoke. She carried herself with the ease of someone who had never been told no, her smile sharp, her gaze dismissive as it swept over the room and landed on Melissa briefly, as though she were nothing more than outdated furniture. James' face changed instantly, pride swelling where disdain had lived moments before. Pamela wrapped herself around him and kissed him without shame, claiming her territory publicly, sealing Melissa's humiliation with a final stroke. Whispers exploded into cheers, relatives beaming with approval, some praising James openly for choosing better, for aligning himself with wealth and status. Someone mentioned Pamela's billionaire father with reverence, as though his money had washed James clean of all wrongdoing. Melissa felt like the ground had opened beneath her feet. Her heart pounded as insults continued, subtle and blatant, about her usefulness, her worth, her failure as a wife. She was told this divorce was a blessing, that doors would open now that she was out of the picture. Her tears finally fell as she signed, each stroke of the pen feeling like a nail, sealing something shut forever. The laughter grew louder, drowning out her quiet sobs, and in that noise, she felt herself disappear. She thought of Job's words, "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" From Job 2 verse 10, though she did not yet understand why such evil had found her seat at the table. No one stopped the cruelty. No one spoke for her. Even the cake candles burned down quietly, wax pooling like silent witnesses to a joy that had died before it was ever celebrated. When the dinner finally dissolved into chatter and self-satisfied smiles, Melissa stood up slowly, her body moving on instinct while her mind lagged behind. She gathered what little dignity she had left and walked out of that room. Past faces that had already forgotten her pain, past Cloverfield neighbors who would soon feast on the story. The night air hit her like cold water, sharp and sobering, and for the first time, she allowed herself to cry freely. Each step away from that house felt like walking through fog, unsure where the road led, only knowing she could not stay. She carried no bags, no plans, only a heart cracked wide open. As she waited for Sandra to pick her up, she looked back once. Not in longing, but in disbelief that a place she had called home could turn into a courtroom without warning. The words of Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1 floated into her mind, uninvited. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, and though she could not yet see what season this was, she sensed that something had ended irrevocably. Cloverfield's lights glowed in the distance, lively and indifferent, already buzzing with the tale of her downfall. Melissa wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the waiting car, unaware that this night, meant to mark her 30th year, had instead marked the painful birth of a version of herself she had not yet met. The days after that night blurred into each other like ink dropped into water, spreading until edges were no longer clear. Melissa moved into Sandra's small apartment on the quieter side of Cloverfield, a place squeezed between a tailor shop and a noisy bus stop, yet it felt strangely muted compared to the roar she had left behind. Sandra did not ask many questions at first. She only handed Melissa a towel, a warm drink, and a clean pillow, understanding that grief often needs silence more than words. Each morning, Melissa woke with swollen eyes and a chest that felt packed with stones, the weight of shame clinging to her like a stubborn shadow. She replayed the birthday dinner over and over, hearing laughter where there should have been kindness, seeing smiles sharpened in knives. Simple tasks became mountains. Even tying her hair felt like climbing uphill with no summit in sight. She blamed herself for everything, telling herself that if she had been more supportive, more patient, more anything, things would have turned out differently. It was as though her mind had turned into a courtroom where she was both accused and condemned without defense. Sandra tried to coax her into eating, reminding her gently that a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, a verse from Proverbs 17 verse 22, she quoted softly, though Melissa could barely taste the food. At night, Cloverfield sounds drifted in through the window, laughter, passing cars, distant music mocking her loneliness, reminding her that the city had not paused for her pain. She cried quietly into her pillow, careful not to wake Sandra, feeling like a guest overstaying her welcome in life itself. The apartment smelled of detergent and old books, unfamiliar yet safe, and still she felt unmoored, like a boat cut loose from its dock. Sometimes she would sit on the edge of the bed until dawn, staring at nothing, whispering prayers that felt unanswered, wondering when exactly she had become so easy to discard. As weeks passed, the world seemed determined to rub salt into her wounds. Cloverfield thrived on spectacle, and James and Pamela's union became the hottest topic, splashed across social media with glossy photos and carefully curated smiles. Melissa tried to avoid her phone, but curiosity tugged at her like a persistent child pulling at a sleeve. One night, against her better judgment, she scrolled. There they were, engagement parties dripping in excess, champagne flutes raised, Pamela glowing in designer dresses, James smiling like a man who believed he had won the lottery of life. Each post felt like a fresh slap, each caption a reminder that while she was picking up pieces, they were living large. It felt like adding insult to injury, like watching someone dance on the ashes of your home. She would drop the phone and sob until her chest hurt, asking God why she had been left behind while others flourished. The words of Psalm 22 verse 1 echoed painfully in her heart. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" though she felt guilty even thinking them. Sandra noticed the pattern and gently suggested boundaries, telling her that comparison was a thief that robbed quietly but thoroughly. Still, Melissa struggled. She felt invisible, erased, as though her years of devotion had amounted to nothing more than a footnote in someone else's success story. Sometimes neighbors recognized her on the street and whispered, eyes wide with thinly veiled curiosity, confirming that Cloverfield had already made up its mind about her failure. She stopped going out unless necessary, choosing the safety of four walls over the sharp edges of public scrutiny. It was a lonely existence, but loneliness felt preferable to being a topic of entertainment. She began to wonder if her life had peaked and declined all before 30, if this sorrow was her portion to carry indefinitely. Sandra, however, refused to let despair have the final word. She became a steady presence, not with loud encouragement but with consistent care, reminding Melissa that healing was not a race and that even cracked vessels could still hold something precious. Some evenings, Sandra shared her own struggles, stories of setbacks she had survived, not to compete with Melissa's pain, but to remind her she was not alone in the valley. They talked late into the night, voices low, the city humming outside like a restless witness. Sandra often repeated Ecclesiastes 9 verse 11, "The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong," explaining that life did not always reward effort immediately, and that delay was not denial. Melissa listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes staring blankly, her heart too tired to argue. On better days, she helped Sandra with chores, folding laundry or washing dishes, small acts that gave her hands something to do while her mind slowly caught up. On worse days, she stayed in bed, curtains drawn, feeling like she was moving through molasses. Yet, Sandra never shamed her for the slow pace, never told her to get over it, understanding that grief had its own calendar. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Melissa began to feel moments of quiet, brief, fragile pauses where the pain loosened its grip just enough for her to breathe. These moments did not last long, but they were enough to remind her that numbness was not permanent. She began journaling, pouring her thoughts onto paper, a silent confession between her and God, even when she felt unheard. Writing became a lifeline, a way to externalize the chaos inside her head. Despite the tiny sparks of comfort, nights remained the hardest. When darkness fell, doubts crept in like thieves in the night, stealing whatever peace the day had managed to offer. Melissa lay awake, questioning her worth, her future, her place in a world that seemed to reward cruelty and punish gentleness. She wondered if she had misunderstood God's promises, if faith was just a story people told themselves to survive disappointment. Yet, even in her questioning, she kept praying, because stopping felt more frightening than continuing. One night, exhausted from tears, she whispered the words of Isaiah 41 verse 10, "Fear thou not, for I am with thee, be not dismayed, for I am thy God," clinging to them like a life raft in turbulent waters. She did not feel immediate relief, but there was a subtle shift, like the first crack of light before dawn. Melissa began to understand that healing was not a straight line. It zigzagged, doubled back, and stalled without warning. Still, something inside her refused to completely give up, a stubborn ember glowing beneath layers of ash. She started to imagine, tentatively, a future not defined by who had rejected her. The thought frightened her as much as it intrigued her, because letting go of pain meant risking hope again. As Cloverfield continued buzzing with gossip and glamour, Melissa remained in that small apartment, quietly wrestling with sorrow and faith, unaware that this season of isolation was slowly teaching her how to stand alone. The tears did not stop overnight, but they began to change, carrying less bitterness and more resolve, as though her heart was preparing unknowingly for a chapter she had not yet dared to write. The turning point did not arrive with fireworks or sudden clarity. It came quietly, like a knock so soft it could easily be ignored. One early morning, after another night of restless sleep, Melissa found herself on the floor beside her bed, knees pulled to her chest, tears soaking into the rug. Her prayers were no longer eloquent. They were raw, fragmented, more sighs than sentences. She told God she was tired of waking up feeling like a mistake, tired of replaying memories that bruised her heart afresh each day. In that stillness, she remembered a time long before marriage, long before Cloverfield's noise had swallowed her identity, when her hands used to move with confidence and joy in the kitchen. Baking had once been her refuge, a place where measurements made sense and patience was rewarded. The thought surprised her, lingering longer than expected. She recalled Psalm 34 verse 18, "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and for the first time in months she felt less alone in her brokenness. That same day, she asked Sandra if she could try baking again, not with grand plans, but simply to keep her hands busy and her thoughts quieter. Sandra smiled in a way that said more than words ever could, immediately clearing a small space in the kitchen and offering to help with ingredients. The first attempt was far from perfect. The pastries came out uneven, some overbaked, some too soft, and Melissa laughed weakly at the results, a sound she had not heard from herself in a long while. It felt like learning to walk after a long illness, wobbly and uncertain, but movement nonetheless. Each recipe she tried became a small act of defiance against despair, a way of telling her pain that it would not have the final say. Slowly, she began waking with a purpose, however modest, and that purpose gave shape to her days, replacing endless hours of rumination with something tangible. As days turned into weeks, baking became more than a distraction, it became a discipline. Melissa started rising early, tying her apron before Cloverfield fully woke, the quiet hours offering a rare piece the city rarely allowed. She read recipes carefully, watched tutorials, took notes like a student eager to learn again. Some days nothing worked, and she had to throw away entire batches, the waste gnawing at her already fragile confidence. On those days, she reminded herself of Galatians 6 verse 9, "Let us not be weary in well-doing. For in due season we shall reap if we faint not," clinging to the promise of a season she could not yet see. Sandra noticed her determination and, without making a fuss, offered to support her financially, insisting it was an investment, not charity. That distinction mattered to Melissa more than Sandra knew. It allowed her to accept help without feeling diminished. They began selling small batches to neighbors, word spreading cautiously through Cloverfield's winding streets. Feedback came unfiltered, some praised, others criticized. But Melissa listened, adjusted, and tried again, understanding that Rome was not built in a day. Each order, no matter how small, felt like a brick laid carefully into the foundation of a new life. There were moments of fear, moments when she wondered if she was chasing a mirage, but she pressed on, reminding herself that even a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The kitchen became her classroom, her therapy, her sanctuary, and in the rhythm of mixing and baking, her heart began to stitch itself back together, thread by delicate thread. Encouraged by steady, if modest, progress, Melissa began attending business seminars, often sitting quietly at the back, absorbing information like dry ground soaking up rain. Walking into those rooms intimidated her at first. She felt out of place among confident voices and polished presentations, her past whispering that she did not belong. Yet she stayed, taking notes diligently, asking questions when her courage allowed. She learned about pricing, branding, consistency, and customer service, concepts that felt foreign but exciting. Each new lesson expanded her vision, showing her that what she was building could become something sustainable, something real. She often reflected on Proverbs 24 verse 27, "Prepare thy work without, and make it fit for thyself in the field, and afterwards build thine house, seeing wisdom in planning before expecting results." Balancing learning with production was exhausting, and there were nights she fell asleep over her notebook, flour still dusting her hands. Sandra continued to be her pillar, celebrating small wins and reminding her not to despise humble beginnings. Slowly, Melissa's confidence grew, not loudly but steadily, like a river carving its path through stone. Customers began returning, recommending her to others, their trust acting as quiet validation. Cloverfield, ever watchful, began to notice her not as a subject of pity, but as a woman doing something with her life. That shift, subtle as it was, fueled her resolve. She was no longer merely surviving. She was learning how to build brick by brick, day by day, even when doubt tried to sneak back in through the cracks. Despite the progress, the journey was far from smooth. There were days when exhaustion weighed heavily, when memories of her old life resurfaced unexpectedly, threatening to unravel her newfound stability. On such days, Melissa allowed herself to feel without drowning, understanding that healing did not require the erasure of pain, only the refusal to be ruled by it. She learned to pray differently, less desperately, more deliberately, often repeating Psalm 37 verse 5, "Commit thy way unto the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass," anchoring her efforts in faith rather than fear. Baking taught her patience in ways she had not anticipated. Rushing a process often led to failure, a lesson that mirrored life itself. She began to see that her past, painful as it was, had sharpened her resilience, giving her a depth she might not have otherwise known. With each successful order, she felt a quiet satisfaction, not rooted in revenge or comparison, but in self-respect. She spoke openly of Sandra's support, crediting her generosity whenever praised, understanding that no one truly rises alone. As the months passed, Melissa realized she was no longer counting the days since her humiliation. Her calendar was filling with plans instead of memories. The ache had not vanished, but it no longer defined her. In the gentle hum of her small operation, she discovered something priceless, the knowledge that even after being broken, she could still create something beautiful, something her own, and that realization changed the way she saw herself forever. Success did not announce itself loudly when it arrived in Melissa's life. It crept in steadily, like dawn easing the night away without asking for permission. Orders increased slowly at first, then with a consistency that surprised even her. What began as neighbors requesting pastries for small gatherings soon grew into calls for birthdays, anniversaries, and modest events across Cloverfield. Her kitchen could no longer contain the volume, and with Sandra's encouragement, she rented a small space that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Each morning, she unlocked the door with a quiet prayer, aware that she was walking into something she had built with trembling hands and stubborn faith. Wealthy clients began to notice the quality of her work, drawn not only by taste but by the care infused into every detail. She treated each order like it mattered deeply, because to her it did. She often reminded herself of Colossians 3 verse 23, "And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men," letting excellence become her signature rather than noise. Cloverfield, ever restless, buzzed with new conversations about her, the tone shifting from curiosity to admiration. People who once whispered behind her back now spoke her name with a different inflection, as though tasting respect for the first time. Melissa noticed the change, but did not chase it. She kept her head down, focused on growth rather than applause. Her days were long, her hands often aching, but her heart felt fuller than it had in years. She invested back into the business, attended more workshops, and hired a small team, choosing humility over haste. Through it all, she remained mindful of where she had started, never forgetting nights when she wondered if she would ever stand on her own again. As Melissa's bakery flourished, her reputation spread beyond Cloverfield's inner circles and into elite spaces where standards were unforgiving. Invitations came to cater high-profile weddings and exclusive gatherings, environments she once thought were worlds apart from her own. Walking into those venues for the first time, she felt a familiar flutter of doubt, but she refused to let it steer her course. She had learned that confidence was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Each successful event strengthened her resolve, reinforcing the truth that her worth was not defined by who had rejected her. She paid Sandra back gradually, insisting on honoring every sacrifice, understanding that integrity was a currency that never depreciated. Melissa spoke openly about Sandra's role in her journey, believing that gratitude multiplied blessings rather than diminished them. She held tightly to Proverbs 11 verse 25, "The liberal soul shall be made fat, and he that watereth shall be watered, also himself, seeing its truth unfold in real time." Meanwhile, Cloverfield's gossip mill churned relentlessly, now marveling at how far she had come. Some praised her resilience, others speculated endlessly about her past, but Melissa learned to let opinions roll off her back like water off a duck's feathers. She had outgrown the need for validation from people who once found joy in her pain. Her success was no longer just about financial stability, it was about reclaiming her voice, her agency, and her sense of self. Each achievement felt less like revenge and more like restoration, a quiet testimony to perseverance. While Melissa's life gained structure and meaning, James' world began to unravel behind closed doors. On the surface, his marriage to Pamela glittered with extravagance, but beneath the sheen, cracks widened daily. Pamela's spending knew no bounds, and James soon realized that her wealth came with expectations he could not meet. She demanded constant attention, status, and access to circles that remained just out of his reach. He found himself scrambling to impress, pitching his skills to people who barely acknowledged him, his confidence eroding with each dismissal. Pamela grew increasingly contemptuous, mocking his ambitions and belittling his family, calling them opportunists without shame. James became a shadow in his own home, catering to her whims, cleaning, cooking, and apologizing endlessly in hopes of keeping the peace. Yet, nothing he did ever seemed enough. He often thought of Ecclesiastes 5, verse 10, "He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase," though the irony was not lost on him. Cloverfield began to sense the tension, whispers emerging about heated arguments and Pamela's public disdain. James' family, once so proud, grew uneasy, realizing that the wealth they enjoyed came at the cost of their dignity. Still, they endured, choosing comfort over conscience, convincing themselves that endurance was temporary. James told himself the same lie, clinging to the lifestyle even as it hollowed him out. In quiet moments, he avoided thinking about Melissa, pushing away rumors of her success, because comparison only deepened his regret. Eventually, the imbalance in James' marriage became impossible to ignore. Pamela's patience wore thin, her tolerance for what she perceived as mediocrity evaporating completely. She began spending more time away from home, returning late, dismissive of James' concerns, her words sharper with each encounter. James felt trapped, aware that the life he had chased was slipping through his fingers like sand. He tried harder, humbled himself further, hoping effort would fix what was fundamentally broken. But Pamela saw him as expendable, a stepping stone rather than a partner. Cloverfield's whispers grew louder, speculation turning into near certainty that all was not well behind the glamorous facade. Meanwhile, Melissa continued her work, unaware of the full extent of James' decline, focused on expanding her business responsibly. She had learned to pace herself, understanding that haste could undo progress. The contrast between their paths was stark, though neither fully grasped the symmetry yet. Melissa often reflected on Jeremiah 29 verse 11, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end," trusting that her journey, painful as it had been, was unfolding with purpose. Cloverfield watched both stories unfold, one rising quietly through discipline and grace, the other crumbling under the weight of pride and misplaced ambition, setting the stage for a reckoning neither could avoid. The collapse, when it finally came, was swift and merciless, like a house of cards caught in a sudden gust of wind. Pamela did not argue or raise her voice the day she handed James the divorce papers. Her calm was more frightening than rage. They were sitting in the living room, surrounded by expensive furniture that suddenly felt like borrowed props. She placed the documents on the glass table casually, as though she were setting down a magazine she had finished reading. James stared at the papers, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes clearly saw. He laughed nervously at first, thinking it was some cruel joke, but Pamela's expression did not soften. She told him, with cutting precision, that he no longer served any purpose in her life, that he had become dead weight she was tired of dragging around. Her words were sharp enough to draw blood without leaving a mark. James begged immediately, pride shattering like brittle glass, promising to change, to work harder, to become whatever she wanted him to be. Pamela listened with visible boredom, then laughed, a sound devoid of warmth, and reminded him that desperation was not attractive. She accused him and his family of exploiting her generosity, of reaping where they did not sow, and demanded repayment for everything she had spent on them. The irony of his position did not escape him. The same man who once humiliated another now knelt in humiliation himself. Pamela quoted no scripture, offered no mercy, only finality. James remembered, unbidden, the words of Proverbs 15, verse 33, "Before honor is humility," and realized too late that he had skipped the humility part entirely. When she ordered him to pack his things and leave, the finality hit him like a physical blow. He walked out of that house, carrying a small suitcase and a heavy regret. The city of Cloverfield watching silently as his fortune evaporated overnight. James returned to his family's home like a prodigal without a feast waiting. The house that once echoed with laughter fueled by Pamela's money now felt cramped and tense. His parents stared at him in disbelief as he recounted what had happened, their faces cycling through shock, anger, and fear. The reality sank in quickly. The lifestyle they had grown accustomed to was gone, and with it, their sense of superiority. The next day, they attempted to visit Pamela together, hoping to appeal to her compassion or pride, but she shut the door firmly in their faces after subjecting them to a barrage of insults that stripped away whatever dignity they had left. Cloverfield buzzed anew, gossip spreading faster than wildfire in Harmattan, tongues wagging about the sudden fall from grace. James' relatives began pointing fingers at one another, blame bouncing around the room like a stray bullet, everyone wounded but no one taking responsibility. Nights became sleepless, filled with murmured regrets and what-ifs that led nowhere. James felt trapped between shame and fear, his future suddenly uncertain. In moments of bitter clarity, he remembered Ecclesiastes 7 verse 8. "Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit," and understood that his impatience for wealth and status had cost him everything stable in his life. Whispers about Melissa reached them more frequently now. Stories of her flourishing business and growing influence, each one landing like salt in an open wound. The family spoke her name carefully at first, then more boldly, planting the idea that she might be the answer to their troubles. Desperation, after all, has a way of reshaping narratives. It did not take long before James was urged, then pressured, to seek out Melissa. His family painted forgiveness as her duty, reminding him of her gentleness, her faith, her supposed inability to turn someone away. At first, James resisted, weighed down by shame, but necessity eventually overpowered pride. He told himself that people change, that time had softened wounds, that perhaps she would see his remorse as sincere. On the morning he decided to go, he barely slept, rehearsing apologies that felt both heartfelt and insufficient. As he made his way through Cloverfield, he noticed how the city seemed different, or perhaps it was simply his perspective that had shifted. When he arrived at Melissa's bakery, he stopped short, stunned by the sight before him. The building was expansive, modern, bustling with activity, far removed from the small kitchen where she once struggled. Customers came and went, staff moved with purpose, and her name was emblazoned boldly on the storefront. It felt like stepping into an alternate reality. James stood there longer than necessary, swallowing hard, aware that he was about to face the living embodiment of the consequences of his choices. He recalled Luke 6, verse 31, "And as ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise," realizing with painful clarity how far he had strayed from that simple principle. When he finally stepped inside, the scent of freshly baked goods filled the air, comforting and unsettling all at once. He asked for Melissa, his voice small, and when she appeared radiant and composed, he almost did not recognize her. Seeing her stirred something fragile inside him, and when James finally began to speak, his words tumbled out in a desperate heap of apologies, confessions, and promises that sounded hollow even to his own ears. He cried openly, shoulders shaking, telling her he had been foolish, blinded, misled, that he now understood her value. Melissa listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, her hands resting calmly on the counter as though she were weighing something carefully. When he finished, expecting Mercy to meet his misery, the silence that followed was heavy and unforgiving. Then she laughed, not softly, not kindly, but sharply, a sound that cut through the room and turned heads. She looked at him the way one looks at something utterly disappointing and asked him where that understanding had been on her 30th birthday, when he turned her joy into a public execution. Her voice rose, controlled but scathing, as she reminded him how he had placed divorce papers beside her cake, how his family had laughed, mocked her, called her bad luck, and urged her to sign as though she were nothing more than nuisance being disposed of. She told him he had stripped her naked emotionally in front of people who already despised her, and now he stood there expecting sympathy. She leaned closer and asked if he truly thought she was a toy he could throw away when bored, then pick up again when his shiny new life cracked. She called his audacity staggering, told him it took a special kind of cruelty to destroy someone publicly and still believe you deserved access to their healing. Her words came like a floodgate breaking loose, years of swallowed pain finding their voice. She reminded him how his mother and relatives had cheered him on, how none of them defended her, how they all celebrated her downfall, and now they hid behind his tears. James began sobbing harder, but she did not stop. She told him that while he was busy chasing wealth and status, she was learning how to survive abandonment, how to cry without an audience, how to rebuild herself from dust. She quoted Proverbs 26 verse 11, "As a dog returneth to his vomit, so a fool returneth to his folly," telling him she would never be foolish enough to return to a man who only recognized her worth after losing comfort. She said forgiveness did not mean reconciliation, and grace did not mean stupidity. She told him he had mistaken her past silence for weakness and her kindness for foolishness, and that error would cost him forever. Her voice shook slightly as she reminded him how she begged God for answers while he paraded another woman, how she questioned her worth while he toasted his new life. She told him plainly that the tears he shed now were nothing compared to the humiliation he had inflicted. That crying did not rewrite history. Then she straightened and delivered her final blow, telling him never to step foot in her shop again, never to mention her name in his family's house, never to come anywhere near her life. She quoted Psalm 101 verse 7, "He that worketh deceit shall not dwell within my house," and told him her life was now a house with doors firmly shut to deceit and betrayal. She ordered him out, pointing toward the door, her eyes blazing with a strength forged in suffering. James stumbled back, sobbing openly now, reduced to the very spectacle he once enjoyed watching. As he left, Melissa stood tall, heart pounding but unbroken, knowing that this was not vengeance but justice, and that for the first time since Cloverfield laughed at her tears, her voice had finally been louder than her pain. After James left her bakery in tears, the air around Melissa felt different, lighter in a way she had not experienced in years. Yet the relief did not come as excitement or triumph. It came as stillness. When the doors closed behind him, she stood where she was for a long moment, breathing slowly, allowing the tremor in her hands to settle. Cloverfield buzzed outside, as it always did, curious tongues already shaping new stories, but for once, the noise felt distant, like thunder far away, after a storm had passed. Melissa walked into her office and sat alone, not to replay the encounter, but to acknowledge what it had taken from her and what it had given back. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for the pain she endured, but for the strength she had gained through it. The words of Psalm 66 verse 12 came to her gently. We went through fire and through water, but thou broughtest us out into a wealthy place. And for the first time, she understood wealth beyond money. She realized that closure did not always arrive wrapped in peace. Sometimes it came through confrontation, through reclaiming one's voice after years of silence. That evening, she went home to her quiet apartment, cooked a simple meal, and slept deeply, untroubled by memories that once haunted her. The past no longer knocked at her door, demanding entry. It had been acknowledged, addressed, and firmly dismissed. James, on the other hand, returned to his family's house broken in a way they could not fix. His cries that night were not just of regret, but of realization. The woman he once dismissed had grown beyond his reach, and no apology could bridge that gap. His relatives listened in stunned silence as he recounted every word Melissa had spoken, each sentence landing like a verdict. Blame circled the room, then collapsed into shame. Cloverfield did not show mercy. Gossip flourished, stories embellished, laughter resurfacing, only now it was aimed at him. He stayed indoors for days, avoiding neighbors, avoiding mirrors, haunted by the truth that some doors, once slammed shut, were not meant to be reopened. He remembered Galatians 6 verse 7, Be not deceived. God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap, and the weight of it pressed heavily on his conscience. His family argued endlessly, each member accusing the other of pushing him toward choices that led to ruin, but no argument could undo the past. Regret became their shared language, spoken fluently and without end. The house that once brimmed with entitlement now echoed with bitterness, and James learned the hard way that favor gained through cruelty was never secure. Melissa continued building her life with intention rather than haste. She expanded her business carefully, mentoring young women who reminded her of her former self, quiet, uncertain, yet full of potential. She spoke honestly about her journey, not dramatizing her suffering, but emphasizing perseverance and self-worth. Cloverfield watched her with fascination now, some with admiration, others with envy, but she no longer tailored her steps to public opinion. She had learned that peace was not found in being understood by everyone, but in understanding herself. When challenges arose, as they inevitably did, she leaned on faith rather than fear, often reminding herself of Isaiah 43 verse 2, When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, trusting that hardship did not mean abandonment. Sandra remained close, their bond deepened by shared history, laughter replacing tears more often than not. Melissa never forgot where she came from, but she refused to live there. Her days were full, her nights restful, and her heart guarded wisely. She loved again, not recklessly, but thoughtfully through friendship's purpose and service. She discovered that moving forward did not require erasing the past. It required learning from it without being chained to it. Cloverfield, lively and relentless as ever, eventually turned its attention elsewhere, as gossip always does, but the imprint of what had happened lingered quietly. Melissa's name became associated with resilience rather than shame, her story whispered with respect instead of ridicule. James and his family lived with their regret, each day a reminder that choices echo long after applause fades. Melissa did not seek their downfall, nor did she celebrate it. She simply lived well. In doing so, she proved something more powerful than revenge, That healing, when embraced fully, speaks louder than bitterness ever could. She often reflected on Proverbs for verse 23, "Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life," guarding her peace fiercely, knowing how hard it had been won. As seasons changed and years unfolded, Melissa remained rooted. Her life, a testament not to luck or circumstance, but to courage, faith, and the quiet strength of choosing oneself after being broken. And though Cloverfield never truly learned to mind its business, one truth became impossible to deny. The woman they once laughed at had risen, not to prove a point, but to claim her life, and that was victory enough. Dear listeners, never allow anyone to define your worth at the moment they choose to abandon you. People may laugh today, clap at your downfall, and dress cruelty as truth, but time has a way of exposing hearts and correcting narratives. Do not rush to prove yourself, do not beg for spaces that rejected you, and do not mistake silence for weakness. Pain can either poison you or prepare you. The choice is yours. When life strips you down to nothing, build yourself back with integrity, patience, and faith, because the strongest glow comes from those who learn to shine in the dark. Remember this: forgiveness frees your heart, but access must be earned. Guard your dignity fiercely, trust the process even when it hurts, and keep moving forward. The same road that humbles others can elevate you if you walk it with wisdom.